How the poor got warm in the coldest nights. When fire was a memory and the wind had teeth, you could always feel it before it arrived. The cold didn't begin with the snow or the frost. It began with a silence, a pause in the birdsong, a stillness in the trees, a shiver in the bones of the wooden door before the wind ever touched it. In the villages of the past, before central heating, before wool was thick and abundant, before chimneys smoked in every roof, winter was something to survive, and the poor knew it better than anyone, not as a season, but as a force, a living presence that crept through the cracks, curled under the eaves, and waited in the corners of empty rooms. They didn't have the luxury to wait for it to come. They prepared as if for a siege, because when the nights grew longer and the sun faded faster, so too did the chances of warmth. Their battle was not just with cold, but with time, with how long a candle could last, with how many coals could be saved from the last fire, with how far a breath could stretch inside a room where frost gathered on the inside of the walls. Blankets were not guaranteed. Wool was expensive, and if you had only one blanket, you didn't wrap it around yourself. You shared it. You curled your body against another child, parent, friend, and you let the heat between you become the only fire you could afford. And still, it wasn't enough. So they learned secrets, not from books, not from scholars, but from experience, passed down through whispered stories by hearthlight. They learned to sleep together, all in one room, all on the floor, bodies stacked like books on a shelf, each spine pressed to another. They learned to keep the dog inside, not just for protection, but because even the breath of an old mutt could keep frost from taking the toes of a baby. They learned to hang old sacks over windows, to push straw in between boards, to breathe slowly to conserve the heat inside their own lungs. But more than anything, they learned to make warmth from memory. When the fire was out, they told stories of the fire, of warmer days, of summer rains, of honey and bread that didn't freeze before it reached the mouth. They spoke not just to pass time, but to ignite something inside that could burn longer than a spark in the hearth. Hope was warmth, and they passed it from voice to ear like an invisible ember. The poorest homes had no fireplaces, only holes in the roof or gaps where smoke could rise and get lost in the sky. So they made do with stones, large ones set near the last cooking fire of the day, wrapped in cloth and carried to the bed to warm the sheets before sleep. Some buried coals in the dirt, topped with ash and straw, and lay close above them like resting atop a dragon that breathed just enough. They didn't own gloves, so they rubbed their hands with animal fat. It sealed in what little warmth they had. And when even that ran out, they used ashes, not for heat, but as a symbol. Ashes said, "We had fire once, and we may again." Children learned not to cry at night. Tears made faces colder. So mothers hummed lullabies not to soothe the ears, but to keep cheeks warm through rhythm and breath. And when words failed, they used touch, a hand over a heart, a palm against a back, fingers interlaced like roots underground, finding strength in one another's pulse. They were not warm, but they were not alone. And that made all the difference, because winter didn't always come to kill. Sometimes it came to teach. To teach the body how strong it was, to teach the soul how much it could carry, to teach a community that fire lived in more than just flame. The fires they built without wood. They didn't always have trees. That was the first lesson. When the forests were too far, when the branches had already been taken, when the snow covered everything brittle and burnable, they had to invent fire from things that were never meant to burn. And still, they burned. Not because they were dry, or clean, or easy, but because necessity is more flammable than oak. In the poorest corners of the world, fire was made from memory, from scraps, from shame. They burned animal dung, pressed into cakes and left to dry. It smoked, it stung the eyes, but it gave enough heat to cook a meal, to boil water, to warm a room for an hour. They burned rags soaked in fat, the ends of rope. Sawdust swept from carpenters' floors. Stems, bark, and even nettles if they dried just right by accident. Sometimes, they stole wood, not from people, but from places. Abandoned wagons, fences at the edge of forgotten roads, old tools that no longer worked. A broken wheel was not trash. It was tomorrow's fire. They learned to borrow heat from each other and from unexpected places. They walked barefoot on stone that had soaked in sunlight, just for the memory of its warmth. They knelt beside ovens that had already gone cold, pressed their backs to the last place the bread had rested, and pretended it was enough. And sometimes it was, because the poor knew something the rich too often forgot. Warmth isn't only physical. They made fire with their voices. Songs hummed in rhythm as they stirred soup over an ember. The music kept their hands moving, their hearts beating, and brought something that flames could not. Courage. They made fire. With their eyes, they stared into coals as if they were doorways, remembering what it felt like to sit at a bonfire in childhood, to feel the face of a mother flushed from the stove. They made fire with each other. In the corners of cellars and one-room shacks, people gathered not just for company, but for ignition. Laughter became flint. Hugs became matches. Even arguments sparked enough friction to warm a soul, if only for a night. And when all else failed, they dreamed. Dreams of better places, of longer summers, of a home with a fireplace that never ran out. And sometimes, those dreams alone were enough to carry them to the morning. The truth no one tells is that the greatest fire the poor ever built was not with wood. It was with will. With hands that refused to give up. With songs that rose through smoke. With the decision, again and again, to believe in the possibility of another warm day. Because fire is not just a flame. It is a declaration that even when the world grows cold, we do not surrender, we spark. We kindle. We refuse to disappear. The rooms without walls. They didn't always have houses. Many had roofs that leaked and walls made of whatever the season hadn't already taken. But some had nothing at all, just cloth, or stone, or sky. And in those moments, a room wasn't something built. It was something imagined, something drawn with breath and bodies and presence alone. They gathered under arches, in ruins where churches had once stood. They crouched behind fallen carts and empty market stalls, treating every small windbreak like a sacred chamber. And when they found nothing but open ground, they became their own shelter. Two backs pressed together, one body curled around another. One mother holding 3 children beneath her skirt, knees to her chest, blocking the breeze with skin that had long forgotten softness. A room was not made of stone. It was made of proximity, of silence shared, of a single flame in a clay bowl. That meant the difference between shivering and simply remembering what it meant to feel. Sometimes they dug shallow pits, laying inside the earth itself, with branches across the top and snow as insulation. It was cold, yes, but it was contained. And in the cold, containment was everything. The poorest of the poor built rooms from straw, mud, even dung. They mixed it with patience, pressed it with feet, smoothed it with palms hardened by wind. And when it cracked, they patched it with hope. Because even walls that crumble are better than none. They used blankets as walls, hung from ropes, dividing space not for privacy, but to keep the heat of one candle from escaping too far. They created corners by stacking boxes, placing baskets, even leaning their own bodies in formation. And those corners became places to read, to pray, to whisper, to dream. Because if you could define a space, you could define a feeling. And if you could name a feeling, even in winter, you could survive it. Sometimes, the room was a barn. The walls shared with cows, the air thick with breath and straw. But it was warmth. And the animals never judged how tightly you wrapped your child or how often you thanked them for doing nothing more than breathing. They didn't always have space, but they had connection. They didn't always have wood, but they had ritual. And ritual builds more warmth than brick. They told stories while sitting on crates. They sang while weaving wool scraps into new shapes. They stared at shadows on the ceiling, imagining they were stars. And the more stories they told, the more rooms they built inside themselves, chambers of memory, vaults of love, cathedrals of silence. You see, for the poor, the warmest room was the one they carried. It had no door, no chimney, no lock. It was a room made of people, songs, crumbs, and closeness. It was never finished, never permanent. But it was enough to keep death at the threshold and let life breathe just a little longer. The clothing made of stories. They didn't always have proper clothes. There were no winter coats thick as armor, no woolen scarves wrapped 3 times around the neck, no gloves with linings or boots with fur. There were layers. Layers of memory. Layers of survival. Layers of anything that could trap a little more warmth between the skin and the world. They wore shirts that once belonged to someone else. Dresses stitched from older dresses. Coats made from blankets and blankets made from curtains and curtains made from sacks. A torn cloak was still a cloak if it could block the wind. A hole in the elbow was a story, not a failure. They sewed patches over patches, not to restore beauty, but to honor the stubbornness of the fabric. And every stitch was a prayer. Let this last another week. Let this keep the child from coughing tonight. And when they ran out of thread, they used strips of linen from old bed sheets. When they ran out of buttons, they tied knots or closed with pins, or let the garment hang open and trusted the fire within. But it wasn't just fabric that warmed them. It was the memory the clothes carried, the apron still stained with flour from better days, the vest sewn by a grandmother when her hands still worked without pain, the hat once worn by a father who walked 6 miles in the snow to sell eggs at the market and returned with bread. They wore their ancestors. They wore their intentions. And even when the threads frayed, the stories didn single quotes children wore socks as mittens. Scarves wrapped around heads, mouths, necks, not for fashion, but because every inch mattered. Some wore paper under their shirts, parchment, leaves, pages from discarded books. Not to read, but to create a layer against the wind. Those pages, warmed by skin, often began to blur. Words melted into one another, ink ran like tears, and yet somehow, the warmth lasted longer when the words were beautiful. There was a kind of coat made only of hope, worn by those who stood in line at bakeries, hands in pockets, waiting for the bread that might not come. Worn by the mother who gave her last shawl to her son with the thin bones and purple lips. Hope was a garment too, invisible, unwashable, but heavy as wool and sometimes just as warm. They learned that to dress for winter was not only to cover, but to remember. That warmth didn't just come from layers but from who you became underneath them. A man in rags, if singing, was warmer than a silent man in furs. A girl in patched shoes with a story to tell could light a room with her breath. Alone, and when night came, when even the socks and the scarves and the stitched up sleeves were not enough, they gathered, piled in corners, curled under quilts too thin to matter. But they told each other, "You're warmer when you talk. You're warmer when you listen. You're warmer when you remember." And so they told stories, not just to pass time, but to weave another layer around the soul. The poor may not have had clothes that gleamed, but they wore resilience like a crown. They may not have had boots, but they walked with the warmth of 1,000 steps before them. And in the coldest nights, they learned that a well-told tale was sometimes the thickest blanket of all. The heat inside the bread. They didn't bake bread for luxury. Bread was life. A ration of hope, a ritual of survival, a small flame in the belly on the longest nights. And yet, there was more to it than flour, water, and salt. The poor didn't just make bread to eat. They made it to stay warm. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was often a single stone or a clay oven built by hand, with firewood saved over weeks or dung cakes Cured carefully in the sun, they would light the oven slowly, not wasting a single ember. And as the dough rose, so did the temperature in the room. They stood close to it, held their hands out as if greeting an old friend. Let the warmth wrap around their fingers, climb into their sleeves, kiss their cheeks that had known too much wind. But the magic was not only in the oven. It was in the bread itself. Once baked, a single loaf could heat the body from the inside like a sun swallowed whole. They held the loaves close to their chests before breaking them, letting the heat bleed through the crust into their thin shirts, into their tired skin. Some even slept with the loaf next to them, wrapped in cloth, so it would stay warm until morning. Children fought over the crust, not for taste, but because it stayed warm the longest. The hard edge, burned black at times, was the last ember of the fire they didn't have fuel to keep alive. Mothers would press slices into the palms of crying babies, not because the babies were hungry, but because the bread gave them something. Warm to hold. It became a source of comfort. A miniature hearth passed from hand to hand. And when bread was scarce, they learned to stretch it, soaked it in broth, turned it into dumplings, let it harden and used it as a spoon to scoop from shared pots. Even when the taste faded, the heat remained. And that was enough. Bread was also a symbol. In every tear of dough, in every rise and crack of crust, there was proof that something could come from almost nothing. That warmth could be coaxed from patience, from love, from silence. It reminded them that they were makers, not just survivors. On feast days rare and holy, the bread became sacred, spiced with herbs, twisted into shapes, marked with knives, to tell stories on the surface. And when it emerged from the oven, golden and steaming, it was as if a small sun had been reborn inside their cold, dim room. They didn't need to light torches. The bread glowed enough. And for a few breaths, a single loaf made of yesterday's flour could hold back the entire winter. So they baked whenever they could, not just to fill the stomach, but to fill the air with heat, with scent, with memory. Bread warmed a home. Bread warmed the soul. Bread, for the poor, was proof that the cold could be beaten one crumb at a time. The warmth of shared silence. Not every night was filled with stories. Not every room echoed with laughter or song. Sometimes the cold grew too loud, and the only answer left was silence. But even in that quiet, especially in that quiet, there was warmth, not from fire, not from food, but from the deep, unseen thread that connects people when words fall away. In the poorest homes, where conversation risked drawing out the breath too fast, where mouths stayed closed to keep from losing heat, silence became active preservation. They sat in it together, around cold hearths, under too thin quilts, on beds made of straw and memory. And in the stillness, they listened, not for danger, not for wind, but for each other. A cough in the corner, the shift of a body on the floor, the creak of an old board as someone turned in sleep. Each sound was a reassurance. We are here. We are not alone. Silence, when shared, became a fire of presence. No flicker, no flame, but a warmth that moved inward, curling up inside the chest, where fear usually lived. They didn't need to speak to understand. The father knew the daughter was cold by the way her breath lingered in the air. The mother knew her son was awake by the rhythm of his blanket's rise and fall. The old woman in the corner, eyes half closed, wasn't asleep. She was listening to the breathing of the home around her, counting its beats like a lullaby. In that silence, memories rose, not because they were told aloud, but because the brain, hungry for warmth, fed itself on the past. It remembered summers, the sound of wheat brushing knees, the way sunlight once fell through a wooden shutter, the taste of ripe berries stolen in a field before the frost came. These weren't stories. They were ghosts of warmth, gathered like invisible blankets around the soul, and silence allowed them to settle, to be felt, to be real. Even children learned it, not out of discipline, but out of instinct. They knew that speaking too much could disturb the thin veil of peace that held the cold at bay. So they learned to listen to their own hearts, to the quiet sound of a fire burning down, to the ache in their fingers that whispered, "Stay still, stay close, stay warm." The poor did not have concerts. They did not gather in parlors to play the violin, but they knew the music of silence. It was the song of survival. It was the hymn of endurance. It was the space in which breath became sacred. Sometimes a single word broke it. Here, still, enough. And even one word was enough to heat the moment, to remind them that silence was not emptiness, but a container for all the things they felt but couldn't afford to say. They knew that the world, when at its coldest, required fewer noises and more nearness, and so they sat, in piles and corners, in beds and baskets and broken chairs, wrapped not just in cloth, but in each other, in shared silence, in mutual understanding, in the warm hum of simply being. The warmth they borrowed from animals. When the firewood ran out and the last ember died in the stove, they turned to the oldest warmth of all, the warmth of another living being. And for the poor, that meant animals, not pets, but companions, in the truest sense. Partners in breath, in warmth, in enduring the long cold nights without complaint. They slept beside goats, their bellies rising and falling like soft breathing drums. Goats didn't need blankets, they were blankets. Children curled against them, small hands buried in thick fur, and drifted into sleep to the slow rhythm of a heartbeat that didn't judge them for being poor. Cows were fireplaces with legs. Their massive bodies radiated heat like living walls. And in some homes, if they could be called that, families slept in barns, not because they had no pride, but because they understood something deeper than pride. Warmth was survival. Pride was a luxury. Dogs too became guardians of warmth. They didn't just bark at strangers. They lay beside sick children, pressed close to the feet of elderly grandfathers, and trembled not from fear, but from the cold. They refused to let their humans feel alone. Even cats, aloof in the day, became quiet furnaces at night, purring into the void of winter, their small bodies curled behind knees, between necks, under shirts, where the heat was needed most. They didn't think of it as strange. They didn't think of it at all. To share space with an animal was to share life, and in the poorest corners of the world, life was a shared resource. There was no mine or yours, only warmth. Only now, some built their homes with that in mind. One room, one family, 3 goats, a cow, a dog that had no name but always came back, straw on the ground, mud on the walls, and breath in the air. It smelled of dung, yes, but also of hay and milk and survival. The poorest knew that heat did not require fire. It required closeness. It required trust. The same hands that milked the cow at dawn rested on her side at night, grateful for the steam that rose from her hide. The same boy who led the goats through snow slept with his cheek on their side, breathing in the scent of fur and earth, and remembering the shape of spring. And in those nights, when the stars were cruel and the sky was silent, the animals said nothing, but they stayed. They stayed when others left. They stayed when the door wouldn't close. They stayed when the baby cried and the mother had nothing more to give but her arms and a song. In the coldest nights, the poor didn't just survive, they made alliances with creatures who needed them as much as they needed them back. Together, they formed circles of warmth without fire, without language, only breath, fur, skin, and the miracle of being alive in the same place at the same time. The fire that lived in their hands. They didn't have torches, or heated blankets, or oil-filled radiators humming in the corners of insulated homes. What they had was their hands, and not just to touch, but to create fire where none existed, because sometimes warmth isn't something you gather, it's something you give. Their hands were cracked, red from wind, raw from work, calloused from years of lifting, sewing, scrubbing, splitting. But within those hands was the oldest heat in the world. Intention. Hands that reached for another when breath began to slow. Hands that massaged frostbitten feet while whispering stories. Hands that carried soup bowls too hot to hold, because love doesn't fear a little pain when someone else is cold. They made fire from friction. Not just of wood against wood, but skin against skin, rubbing arms, pressing backs, holding tight until the shivering stopped. Even just placing a palm over another's heart was enough, sometimes to bring the body back from the edge. Mothers used their hands to rub the chest of a coughing child. Not because they expected the sickness to vanish, but because the motion warmed both of them. Fathers used their hands to lift old men from straw beds, moving them nearer the oven's last breath. Sisters held sisters not because they were weak, but because together they were strong enough to face another night. The poor didn't have much, but their hands were never idle. Even in the coldest hours, they found things to repair, to braid, to fold, to twist, because movement itself was resistance. A still hand became numb. A moving hand created heat. So they peeled potatoes, shaped clay, mended coats, scrubbed pots that didn't need scrubbing, not for cleanliness, but for survival. Hands stitched, hands stirred. Hands held candles up to broken windows to make the darkness less sharp. And in those moments, they weren't just tools. They were lanterns. Sometimes, at the end of the day, a child would crawl into a parent's lap, take one of those tired hands, and hold it between their own. "Your hands are warm," they'd say. And the parent would smile, because they knew the heat was borrowed from love itself. In rooms with no fire, hands gave what stoves could not. They braided hair, traced the edges of faces, washed cracked feet in basins of tepid water, and whispered, "You're here, you matter, you are not alone." And when morning came, those hands would start again, lighting matches, stirring ashes, brushing frost from windows to let the smallest hint of dawn slip in. Because as long as their hands could move, they could build a little fire somewhere. The warmth of waiting for spring. They always waited, not idly, not with complaint, but with a kind of hope that flickered quietly like a candle someone protected with both hands. They waited for spring, and even though winter clawed at their walls and bit their fingers and froze their wells, they held fast, because spring always came, eventually. It wasn't just the sun they missed. It was the permission it brought. Permission to smile without trembling, to open doors without dread, to let children run barefoot again on soil that no longer hurt. But even before it arrived, the poor found warmth in the waiting, not because it heated the skin, but because it gave the soul something to stretch toward. They marked the days with scratches on wood, not to count how long they had suffered, but to prove they were surviving. Each mark a tally of endurance. Each week a victory over stillness, over silence, over snow that refused to melt. And in those darkest hours before the thaw, they made small springtimes inside themselves. A sprig of dried lavender hidden in a drawer. A story passed down about flowers that once burst through the cracks of stone. A memory of grass that had once tickled a child's feet before frost taught them to stay still. They boiled bark for tea, not because it tasted good, but because it smelled like something green. And that scent alone could warm a room for minutes. Sometimes they planned gardens they knew they might never plant, drew rows in the dirt with sticks, spoke aloud the names of seeds as if calling them back from sleep. Peas, turnips, sunflowers. The words were soft but bright, like embers that didn't burn but glowed. Waiting wasn't passive. It was an act of faith. The faith that the ground would loosen again, that boots would dry out, that goats would birth again, that markets would open, that sun would land on the face like a kiss instead of a warning. They fixed things for spring, even before spring said it was coming. Repaired roof tiles, beat dust from cloths, sanded wooden spoons, sharpened old knives. These were not chores. They were rituals of readiness. As if saying, we will be warm again. And we will be ready for it when it comes. The warmth of waiting wasn't hot, but it was real. It pulsed through their conversations, through their hands in the soil, through the way they smiled at smoke instead of coughing at it. And when a bird finally returned, just one, singing its thin song from a crooked branch, they didn't cheer, they nodded. Because they had waited, because they had known, because some warmth doesn't come from fire, it comes from faith. The cold that taught them how to hold. In the end, it was the cold itself that taught them how to hold. Not just objects, not just children or bowls or rags, but each other, themselves, moments, life. Because when warmth is rare, you learn to never waste a single drop of it. And when your fingers ache from absence of heat, you understand what it means to wrap around something as if it matters more than anything else. The poor held on to what they had, not because it was grand, but because it was theirs. A spoon passed down from a grandmother became a totem. A chipped cup, a survivor of generations of tea and snow, became sacred. They didn't have cabinets full of silver. They had 3 mugs, a cracked pot, and the habit of cradling each item like it remembered everything they'd survived together. Held hands often, not to celebrate, not to make promises, but just because hands were warm and fingers linked together meant no one slipped away. Old couples, silent on wooden chairs, gripped each other's knuckles as if letting go meant letting. In the winter again, children slept curled against parents, not for fear, but because they knew to be held was to be safe. To hold was to be human. And they held time too. They cherished the hours when the sun peeked out, the minutes before the kettle whistled, the quiet moments between chores when nothing hurt and nothing asked. They learned that you could hold a breath, hold a prayer, hold a silence so thick that it carried you to the other side of the season. And most of all, they held each other through the unspoken. When death came, they didn't speak of it right away. They sat and held the absence, the memory, the coat left hanging behind the door. The seat still warm, though no one would return to it. Even grief was held as if it, too, deserved warmth. They became masters of holding what could not be fixed. A broken shoe, a shattered plan, a love gone quiet, a future unsure. They held these things gently, not to repair, but to respect, because some things are not meant to be solved, only survived, only honored. In those coldest winters, when every breath turned to smoke and every window wept with frost, the poor taught the world something precious, that warmth is not found in wealth. It is found in closeness, in touch, in care. That to hold someone, even for a minute, can be the difference between despair and endurance. Spring came, as it always did. But it did not erase the cold. It only softened it, made it a memory, turned the hardship into a story to be held for those who would come after. They still told those stories, long after their hands grew stiff, long after they had fire again, because the poor never forgot. It wasn't the heat that saved them. It was the way they held one another through the cold.